So, are Americans too stupid for democracy? This is an article from Alternet. It's by Joshua Holland. How can we rationally pursue our self-interest when we don't even know what's going on? Now, I have seen some of these studies, and it was actually the reason why I wanted to introduce civics and democracy into our schools. If we're not learning democracy in our public education and we're not learning our civics, I mean, this is just how to empower ourselves to be participatory in our own society. Especially Kentucky. Kentucky, we have in every single county, in 120 counties, there's probably about 20 to 30 different elected positions. And if there's only, 20 or 30 people that's going after these elected positions, then they will always be the ruling class. They'll always be the ones that are in power. So it starts out in 2011, Newsweek asked 1,000 Americans to take the standard U.S. citizenship test, and 38% of them failed. So just to become a citizen, you have to get 6 questions out of 10, and 40% of Americans failed. So some immigrants will come over here and people say, there was the Louisville shooting, right? There was, what was it, Mannion? I don't know, that African, 30-year-old African guy. He had got shot, and I read some of the comments on DWRB, and they were sitting there saying, well, you come to our country, you should know the way the way our rules are. Well, you don't even know the way your rules are. At least 40% of y'all don't. So, 1 in 3 couldn't name the vice president, Joe Biden. 2009 study in the European Journal of Communications looked at how informed citizens of the U.S., UK, Denmark, and Finland were of the international news of the day, and the results weren't pretty. Overall, the Scandinavians emerged as the best informed, averaging 62 to 67%. So, Scandinavian, Finland, Sweden, and the other one. We didn't fare, let's see, the British were relatively close behind with 59%, and the Americans lagging in the rear with 40%. We didn't fare much better when it came to domestic stories. Widespread ignorance of objective reality poses a genuine threat to democracy. If we don't even know what the reality of the situation is, the people of the United States have ignorance in abundance. The way representative democracy is supposed to work is pretty simple. You don't want a mob rule, because when you have, the will of the majority, they can take away the rights of the minority. So you have to protect the fundamental rights of the minority so it doesn't just become two wolves voting on which, to have the lamb for dinner, right? If you have 3 voters, 2 are wolves, 1 is lamb, and the 2 wolves says, let's eat the lamb for dinner. So you have to protect the rights of the minority. If you're a lamb, you're allowed to live and exist. But the will of the majority, as long as the minority is protected, then the will of the majority prevails. So you're supposed to act in your own rational self-interest, elect representatives who will pursue the greatest good for the greatest number of citizens. That's how it's supposed to work. That's the theory, but rational is the key word in that formulation. What happens when lots of citizens don't have a solid grasp of what's going on in the real world? So it considers a couple examples. It says people don't recognize their lack of competence, so therefore they can't judge the competence of politicians. They overrate, their own abilities. For people on the bottom who are doing really badly, those in the bottom 10 or 15th percentile, they think their work falls in the 60th or 55th percentile, so they think they're above average. And so that's a problem. There was a guy who actually did a bell curve. He measured a bell curve, and some folks were, if you just assume that you have the population, and so some people aren't going to be great, leaders aren't going to be as competent, and then some are going to be really great, but the vast majority are going to be in the middle. So if you're one of the mediocre people, it says that when you come to vote, then you will actually vote for someone more like yourself, a mediocre politician. Politician thinks that their constituents are much further to the right than polls suggest. So there's a lot when it comes to same-sex marriage, efforts to combat global warming and universal health care. There's a huge gap between how conservative politicians thought their constituents were and what the polls actually showed. The divide was especially pronounced among Republicans, who overestimated their constituents' rightward tilt by an average of 20 percentage points. So most politicians even think that the population is very far to the right. The wealthy think they're wealthy should pay more in taxes, but they don't think that they're wealthy. So, Americans all seem to think they're middle class, even those in the top 5% of all earners. As a result, they frequently misunderstand what political mantras like "let's tax the rich" really mean. Let's see. It says 6% of Americans in households earning over $250,000 a year think their taxes are too low. Of that same group, 26% said that their taxes were about right, and 67% said their taxes were too high. If you're making over $250,000 per year, you're one of the rich. I was pushing for the 1% being taxed, whereas $250,000, that is wealthy. But it's not the 1%. If you make $250,000 per year, you are in the top 4%. Okay, so Americans like Sweden's distribution of wealth, but they already think that they have it. Government spending is actually decreased under Obama, but nobody seems to know it. A recent poll conducted by Fox News found that 83% of Americans think federal spending is out of control, up 21 points since 2009. 83%. As economist Jared Bernstein notes, federal spending as a share of our economic output, which rose rapidly in 2007 and 2008 because of the crash, has decreased since Obama took office in 2009. Even in terms of dollars spent, rather than the share of our output, it's been essentially flat. Writing in Forbes, Rich Ungar adds that spending has grown more slowly under Obama than any other administration since, wait for it, Eisenhower. That includes the 2009 stimulus package, and of course, during his first term, Reagan led the pack in terms of increased federal spending. The younger Bush's second term came in second. So who spends the most? What kind of presidents? The Republican presidents. The Reagan administration, and then Bush's second term, you saw spending grow faster than every other administration. The deficit has been stabilized and it's shrinking, but only 6% of Americans know it. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the federal deficits projected over the next 10 years have fallen dramatically by $4.5 trillion since late 2010. The CBO says this year's deficit will work out to $845 billion, the first time it's been under $1 trillion since 2008. But over that time, Americans of all political stripes have become more concerned with the deficit, according to Pew. What's the disconnect? Ignorance. A recent poll conducted by Bloomberg News found that the size and trajectory of the U.S. deficit is poorly understood by most Americans, with 62% saying it's getting bigger, 28% saying it's staying about the same this year, and just 6% saying that it's shrinking. So 62% says the deficit's getting bigger, 28% says that it's the same, and only 6% says it's shrinking. Only 6% of Americans actually understand that the deficit is getting smaller. Foreign aid is pocket change. The old age conundrum in terms of the public's view of fiscal priorities is that Americans want lower taxes, less government, lower deficits, but oppose cuts to any specific programs other than defense. How does one square that circle? By noting how out of touch most people are with how their tax dollars are spent. A 2001 poll conducted by CNN found that Americans on average think we spend 10% of the federal budget on foreign aid. And 1 in 5 said we spend 30% or more helping others abroad. 30%, 10%. What's the actual figure? It's 1%. The average American also thinks we spend 5% of the budget on public broadcasting when it's just 1/10 of 1%. So when Mitt Romney was talking about cutting Sesame Street, that's only 1/10 of 1%. So they're not even going after, the parts of the budget that is being spent the most. Americans on average say the federal government wastes 51 cents of every tax dollar, the highest level ever recorded since the poll was first taken in 1979. It's subjective, but here's where the tax dollars actually go. So defense and international security assistance, 20%. So 20 cents of every dollar is going for defense, international security. Social Security is 20%. So 20 cents of every dollar, 1 out of every 5. Pennies is going for Social Security. Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program, is 21%. So those are your big cash cows. Defense, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP. Then safety net programs is 13%. Interest on debt is 6%. So remaining program areas, benefits for federal retirees and veterans is 7%, transportation infrastructure is 3%, education 2%, science and medical research 2%, non-security international 1%, all other 4%. So what does this author suggest? So we just give up on democracy. Winston Churchill, he quoted from someone else, but he said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. The problem isn't the form of government, but the ignorance of our polity. When it comes to complacency, there's nothing worse than a dictatorship, you know. In a democracy, if you're complacent and you're not participating in your government, you'll have a de facto dictatorship. You'll have a police state. So the problem isn't the form of government, it's the ignorance of the polity. And that's a problem that can be addressed. Why are so many Americans ignorant? Why don't Americans understand what is going on? Probably lack of curiosity. We have Google, we're the information age, right? The study cited above, which found that people in the UK, Denmark, and Finland are significantly better informed about the issues of the day, noted that some of the differences can be attributed to various models of media funding. So by cutting Sesame Street, it's not just Sesame Street, it's PBS and it's KET. So if you want to cut, you know, KET and PBS, that's one of the problems, is that by having actual public media to inform the population, it can be biased. It's the state-run media, right? So it could have a biasness to it. But it's actually the government getting the information out. And so every once in a while, Bashir will do a video about some big initiative that he actually goes through. But we passed about, 50 to 75 new laws this year. We do it every year. And what are those new laws? How are they implemented? Did the people actually weigh in? I don't think so. I think the politicians trick the people, get elected, or, they get a bunch of money and then just do a bunch of Republican talking points, so you just assume they're going to do what you want. But ultimately, they do whatever they want without any sort of, if the media, if the free capitalistic media is not informing us, and then we don't have enough, KET and PBS informing us, then the politicians are going to do whatever they can. There's some bills, even with the United States of America, that's done behind closed doors. The Patriot Act was like that. They just shoved the Patriot Act, down the throats of America, and then the next day it's passed. It was, 300, 400, 600 pages long. And most of the congressmen and senators who had passed it didn't even read it. So when Rand Paul says we should read the bills before we pass them, that's actually a novel idea. They should read, the bills before they pass them. The 3 European countries all have more public television and radio, which researchers found offered more hard news and analysis and less puffery. So that, more public, local governments could do the same thing. Local governments, there's fiscal court meetings, there's city council meetings. There's fair board meetings, school board meetings. There's a lot of decisions that are being made in every county that, if the county had its own media, they could get out to the public. Education is another big difference. In those countries, spending on education is more or less uniform between schools and school districts. So I think education is one of the biggest ones, okay? I think, public financing when it comes to media and, public television and radio is necessary, and we do need to have more of that. But education is another big difference. In those countries, spending on education is more or less uniform between schools and school districts. In the U.S., the amount spent on education varies wildly by school, district, and state. Anchorage gets about $20,000 per capita per student. Whereas Barberville gets about $9,000. Now that's compared to like Sudbury schools, which you pay $5,000. So I think that, charter schools, if it goes in the way of more democracy, Sudbury education and Summerhill type of education where they actually empower you, where they teach it at democratic institutions and, actually encourage your curiosity, and you have a more of a discovery model of learning. And the teaching of civics. If you want to empower somebody, get them to actually make real decisions that actually impact people's lives. So education is a huge problem. I went to teacher training school. I've spent $60,000 lost. It's all gone. Maybe even more, $70,000 to $80,000. And the biggest thing with all of them, all the teachers believe in the 100% compliance. To teach like a champion, you have to have 100% compliance. And so that means they listen to their masses, they listen to their dictators, they don't actually, they don't want to think for themselves. I was reading a little bit about Paulo Freire, and Paulo Freire was trying to provoke a discussion amongst his students, and one of the students says, why don't you just tell us the answer instead of making us think, because this is just too hard to do. We don't want to think. And so he points out that that's a problem. If you're just waiting to be fed information and then to regurgitate, well, you're not actually, that's not education. Isaac Asimov says that all education is self-education. And I had a professor, Karen Dunnigan, who made that sound like, yeah, that's true. All education is self-education. For 3 hours, I lecture at you, and then you got to go home and actually educate yourself. Well, that's very irresponsible. It's almost like they're making education to be some sort of joke. So they're saying the financing behind the education is one thing, but it's not just the financing, because we have enough money in the schools, even in Kentucky, which is one of the poorest states. We have enough money in the schools, but we're not actually employing the best outcome for the schools. Let's see. So they say it's in vogue to blame teachers or unions for what ails, and that's a part of it. But this author is making the argument that poverty and inequality are the driving forces behind our kids' relatively low educational outcomes. So Linda Darling Hammond, professor of education at Stanford, recently told Alternet students in American schools where fewer than 10% of the students live in poverty are actually #1 in the world in reading. The place where we see the negative effects are in the growing number of schools with concentrated poverty, where more than 75% of the children are poor. The children in those schools score at levels that are near those of developing countries. So poverty is a huge issue. Having public media, public finance media is a big issue. And then I think the education, it's not just in vogue to blame teachers, and it's not the unions. I think I've talked to teachers that don't give a shit about the union. The union actually does a lot for the teachers, but they pretend like, oh yeah, the chancellor, Julie Chancellor, she had actually said, oh, the unions, they do something. I don't know what they do. Yeah, of course not, because she doesn't understand democratic processes, how to get along, how to make decisions as a governing body together. It's more about a dictatorship. This is my classroom, so shut your mouth. And as long as we're used to dictatorships, as long as we're, and the adults aren't employing democratic virtues, we will never see democracy get better. We won't do it. Because, what's the idea? Once you graduate, then you got to get a job, you go to the military, you go to college. College is the same way. Dictators, even the professors have learned that you need 100% compliance. Shut your fucking mouth, boy or girl, and get in line. So we have a bunch of sit-down, shut-up students. And another thing that Paulo Freire points out is sort of the African man. I think it's Franz Fanon that he had quoted, but he had pointed out that even though the Africans who are being oppressed by the French imperialists and they're doing heinous things, in Haiti, stories where they would bury them up to their neck and then just sort of let the birds and buzzards eat at them, and so they would do these atrocious things, but the Africans wouldn't rebel against their oppressors. But as soon as one African saw another African just give them the stink eye or give some smallest slight, then they're ready to, go to war. How dare you? Fuck you. You can't talk to me like that. And that is a byproduct of the oppression. When you attack your fellow, African, or your fellow worker bee, or your fellow, whatever you want to put it, the wage slave, if you're in a workplace, when you attack your fellow worker, you're actually attacking the oppressor, but you can't attack the oppressor. So in order to maintain the little bit of dignity that you got, whenever your, co-worker, your equal, acts like the oppressor to you, then you use violence, or you get all crazy and say, no, how dare you, I will not, put up with this bullshit. And I see that in American culture too. So, you'll have poverty all over the place. We're not attacking the banks, we're not attacking the politicians. Most of us don't attack, most of us are peaceful people, but I see a lot of folks, neighbors get into disputes, and poor folks get into it with each other, instead of actually, targeting the main oppressors. So those poverty, inequality, it's given poor education, supposedly. I could do well in a poor school, if given the chance, and education, the dictatorship model of education itself, as well as the lack of public finance media. So if the public was actually being informed, I mean, just in Louisville, what does the Louisville Metro Council do? Whenever there's a big decision, you can rely on the lamestream corporate media to tell you about that, but there's a lot of backdoor, deals. I went to one of them, and it was videotaping, and it was like, hey, what are you doing? They videotape every single one of them, so why would they be weirded out that somebody else is videotaping them? And but the videotape of and there was only like 3 people that was in the gallery, but the videotape, which is good, it's good that they're actually putting that information out there, but the politicians, the Metro Council, men and women, they understand that that part's the show. The actual decisions are in, smoky backdoor rooms and smoke-filled backdoor deals is where all the deals are actually happening. So, are Americans too stupid for democracy? Right now, the answer is yes. If you just look at Kentucky's election, 87% did not even vote. That's the very least that you can do of your civic duty. If you're not voting, you're not going to be part of the school board. You're not going to be a judge executive or a magistrate. You're not going to do anything else. 87%, the vast overwhelming majority of Kentuckians did not do the very least of their democratic duties. And if you can't even vote, then, I'm saying that's the least. So if you're not voting, then you're not paying attention to the issues, the international issues. And, so solidarity, democracy, I think those they're not being employed even at the very basic level. So if they're not being employed at the very basic level, then to actually get, like workplaces. I mean, workplaces are notoriously known to be dictatorships. You got the boss. Sometimes you'll have little shift leaders, and then everybody has to bow down to the shift leaders and the bosses. But you're not going to learn democracy there. Corporations are very hierarchical, the corporate ladder. You got the HQ, and they have a very, a chain of command, a very specific chain of command. And so you're not going to learn democracy at the workplace. The households, only 3 or 4 people. You could do democracy there. I think you could do a unanimous decision of democracy. I have wife, 2 kids, then that's 4 people. We can all agree on one idea and the action for what the body of us should do. And I think that would be the best way to do it, because then everybody's included, and that's one of the basic human necessities is to feel included. So we're not learning it in the home. I mean, there's only a couple people, but that's what a quorum is, like 5 people, right? And sometimes less, but usually 5 people is considered a quorum. So if you have 5 people, I don't know, you could have a 2-person democracy, a 3-person democracy, and if we're not learning it at the homes and we're not learning it at the workplace, where are we learning it at? We have public schools. You put kids through the public school car wash for 18 years. So when you're putting them through the public school car wash for 18 years, why don't we empower them? And then empower each other. So they're getting along, they tolerate each other's opinions, they learn to stand up and speak up for themselves, and we start to see how democracy is supposed to work. It's not, let's all kiss the boss's butt, and if somebody steps out of line, we all make fun of that person. It's, Malcolm X's sort of house versus field Negro. I remember actually in a class that I was going to take, but essentially, I didn't feel any room to speak. You had one dictator, but it was about we were learning pedagogy of the oppressed. We were learning about Paulo Freire, and it struck me as ironic that we're going to be learning about how the oppressed and the oppressor is. Meanwhile, we're being oppressed by the dictator, and the rest of us were being the oppressed. And so, I dropped the class. I'm not going to sit there and just, be pounded into submission while some Uncle Tom, makes fun of me because I have an independent idea. He's got an independent thought. Oh my God, he thinks for himself. What a loser. And then when they say shut up and sit down, and then you just shut up and sit down, you're the loser. You're the one that was compliant and obedient. And Howard Zinn says compliance, obedience is the reason why we have the worst atrocities throughout human history. War, genocide, slavery, all came about because of compliance and obedience. Probably even police brutality. Probably all of it. Poverty, healthcare, the #1 for cancer, pollution. This is all Kentucky statistics. Compliance and obedience. But that's what they're being taught in our public education school is to get 100% compliance and obedience. And if you ever seen August Messemer, it was during the Nazi parade. Everybody's doing the Hitler salute, and then he's just got his arm crossed. So even Adolf Hitler didn't get 100% compliance. But if we're being brainwashed and we're learning that the most obedient are the ones that are getting the straight A's and they're the ones that are going to excel and do well, then it gives us the false notion that those who do well are the ones that are obedient and compliant versus the very opposite, which we need entrepreneurs, people willing to take risks, and people to think outside the box. In fact, that's the only way history has ever been moved, is by people who think outside the box. So, better education, more public spending, and poverty and inequality also has an effect on education too. We're the information age, so if we can get the internet to the impoverished people, then we should theoretically be able to teach ourselves. That might not work, but that's the theoretical portion of it. Okay.